The Great California Gold Rush, a bedtime story. Settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let me tell you a story that happened long ago when the American West was still wild and full of dreams. Chapter 1: The Glimmer That Changed Everything. In the gentle rolling hills of Northern California, where the American River winds its way through valleys dotted with oak trees, there lived a man named James Wilson Marshall. It was January 24th, 1848, and the morning mist clung to the water like a soft blanket. James was a carpenter by trade, a quiet man with weathered hands and thoughtful eyes, working for John Sutter at his lumber mill in a place called Coloma. As the sun began to peek through the pine trees, casting long golden shadows across the water, James walked down to inspect the mill's tail race, the channel that carried water away from the mill wheel. The water ran clear and cold, babbling softly over the rocky bottom. But something caught his eye that morning, something that would change not just his life, but the entire course of American history. There, glinting in the shallow water like captured sunlight, were small yellow flakes. James knelt down slowly, his heart beginning to race. He picked up one of the shiny pieces, feeling its weight in his palm. It was heavier than he expected, and it had a particular luster that made it different from fool's gold or mica. He bit it gently. Real gold was soft enough to leave teeth marks. Gold, he whispered to himself, the word barely audible above the gentle murmur of the stream. This is gold. James gathered several more pieces, his hands trembling slightly with excitement and disbelief. He rushed back to tell John Sutter, the Swiss immigrant who owned vast lands in the Sacramento Valley. Sutter was a man of grand ambitions who had built his own little empire in California, complete with a fort, farms, and hundreds of workers. When Marshall burst into Sutter's office that morning, holding out his hand to reveal the precious metal, Sutter's face went pale. They tested the metal together, first with aqua regia, a mixture of acids that would dissolve most metals but leave gold untouched. The yellow flakes remained bright and unchanged. They weighed the metal and found it much heavier than ordinary rocks. There was no doubt about it. This was genuine gold. But rather than celebrating, Sutter felt a deep worry settle in his chest like a cold stone. He knew what would happen if word got out. His peaceful agricultural empire would be overrun. His workers would abandon their posts to search for gold. His dreams of a quiet, prosperous life in California would be shattered. "We must keep this secret," Sutter told Marshall urgently. "Promise me you won't tell anyone about this discovery." Marshall nodded. But secrets have a way of escaping, especially secrets as exciting as gold. Within days, whispers began to spread among Sutter's workers. Someone had found something valuable at the mill. The Native Americans who worked at the fort began to notice the strange behavior of the white men, the hushed conversations and furtive glances. One of Sutter's workers, a man named Isaac Humphrey, had worked in the gold mines of Georgia years before. When he saw the yellow flakes, he knew immediately what they were and how to extract them. Word spread to the nearby trading post, then to the small settlements scattered throughout the valley. By March, the secret was beginning to leak out like water through a cracked dam. A storekeeper named Sam Brannan heard rumors of the discovery and decided to investigate for himself. What he found at Sutter's mill convinced him that this was the opportunity of a lifetime, not necessarily to mine gold himself, but to profit from those who would. Brannan was a clever businessman. He quickly bought up all the mining supplies he could find: pickaxes, shovels, pans, and provisions. Then he did something that would ignite the greatest gold rush in American history. On May 12, 1848, he walked through the streets of San Francisco, holding up a small bottle filled with gold dust. "Gold, gold, gold from the American River," he shouted at the top of his lungs. The effect was electric. Within days, San Francisco, a sleepy port town of about 1,000 people, began to empty out. Sailors abandoned their ships in the harbor. Soldiers deserted their posts. Shopkeepers closed their stores and headed for the hills. The Great California Gold Rush had begun. Chapter 2: The Journey of Dreams. News of the California gold discovery spread across the continent like wildfire in dry grass. In the eastern United States, newspapers printed breathless accounts of nuggets the size of eggs in streams where gold could be gathered by the handful. The stories grew more fantastic with each telling, and soon the entire nation was gripped by gold fever. In a small farmhouse in Missouri, a young man named Thomas McKinnon read the newspaper by candlelight, his wife Mary sitting beside him, mending clothes for their two small children. The farm had been struggling, and the wheat crop had failed again this year. When Thomas read about ordinary men becoming wealthy overnight in California, hope flickered in his chest like a candle flame. "Mary," he said quietly, "what if we could go to California? What if we could find enough gold to buy a proper farm, maybe in Oregon or back here in Missouri?" Mary looked up from her sewing, worry creasing her brow. "Thomas, it's so far away. And what about the children? What about the farm here?" Similar conversations were taking place in countless homes across America. In New York tenements, Irish immigrants who had fled the potato famine saw California as another chance at the American dream. In Georgia, experienced miners prepared to take their skills westward. In small towns throughout New England, young men formed companies, pooling their money to fund the journey to California. There were three main routes to California, each presenting its own challenges and adventures. The sea route around Cape Horn was the longest, a journey of 18,000 miles that could take 6 to 8 months. Ships had to navigate the treacherous waters at the southern tip of South America, where fierce winds and towering waves had claimed many vessels. The Panama route was shorter, but more dangerous. Travelers would sail to Panama, cross the isthmus on foot or by mule through dense jungle filled with disease-carrying mosquitoes, then catch another ship on the Pacific side. Yellow fever, cholera, and dysentery claimed many lives on this route. But it was the overland route that captured the imagination of most gold seekers. The journey of approximately 2,000 miles across the American continent followed the same trails that had been used by fur trappers and early settlers. It was a 5-month odyssey through prairies, deserts, and mountains that would test the endurance and determination of even the strongest travelers. In Independence, Missouri, the jumping-off point for the Western trails, the spring of 1849 brought scenes of incredible activity. The town's population swelled from a few hundred to several thousand as gold seekers gathered supplies and formed wagon trains. The main street was clogged with ox-drawn wagons piled high with provisions: flour, bacon, coffee, beans, sugar, and salt. Mining equipment clanked and rattled: picks, shovels, pans, rockers, and mercury for separating gold from sand. The 49ers, as they came to be called, were mostly young men in their 20s and 30s. They came from every walk of life: farmers and merchants, doctors and lawyers, teachers and laborers. Some traveled alone, others in small groups of friends or family members. Many joined larger companies formed in their hometowns, complete with constitutions, elected officers, and shared expenses. Dr. William Swain from Youngstown, New York, was typical of many gold seekers. An intelligent, educated man, he left behind his wife and young daughter to join the Wolverine Rangers, a company of men from his area. In his letters home, which his wife carefully preserved, he described the hopes and hardships of the journey west. "My dearest Sabrina," he wrote from the trail, "we are now 3 weeks out from independence, and the prairie stretches before us like a green ocean. The wildflowers are beautiful beyond description, lupines and Indian paintbrush painting the grassland in brilliant blues and reds. At night, when we gather around our campfires, the men tell stories of the fortunes we'll make in California. I think of you and little Cora constantly, and dream of the comfortable home we'll have when I return with gold in my pockets." But the trail west was far from the romantic adventure many had imagined. The Platte River route across Nebraska was relatively easy, following the flat river valley through endless grassland. Here, travelers saw vast herds of buffalo, thousands upon thousands of the massive animals stretching to the horizon. Native American tribes, particularly the Lakota and Cheyenne, often came to trade with the wagon trains, offering buffalo robes and moccasins in exchange for coffee, sugar, and manufactured goods. The real challenges began when the wagon trains reached the Rocky Mountains. At South Pass in Wyoming, the Continental Divide presented its own obstacles, though it was one of the gentlest crossings of the mountain range. But beyond lay the most difficult part of the journey: the deserts of Nevada and the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. The desert crossing was a nightmare of heat, dust, and thirst. Water was scarce, and what could be found was often alkaline and barely drinkable. Oxen and mules died by the hundreds, their carcasses marking the trail like grim milestones. Travelers were forced to abandon wagons and precious possessions as their animals gave out. The trail was littered with furniture, books, tools, and mining equipment, dreams discarded in the desperate rush to reach California before winter. John Steele, traveling with a company from New York, wrote in his diary, "The desert is a terrible place. The sun beats down mercilessly, and there is no shade anywhere. We've been walking for 2 days now, our wagon abandoned when our oxen died. My lips are cracked and bleeding, and my tongue feels like leather. But still we press on, driven by the dream of gold." As if the desert wasn't challenge enough, the Sierra Nevada mountains presented the final and most dangerous obstacle. The granite peaks rose thousands of feet into the sky, their slopes covered with dense forests and treacherous trails. The passes were narrow and steep, requiring travelers to dismantle their wagons and lower them down cliff faces with ropes, and always there was the fear of winter. Those who reached the mountains too late in the season faced the terrifying prospect of being trapped by snow, like the tragic Donner Party had been just 3 years earlier. The race against time added urgency to every step, every decision. Despite all these hardships, they came in unprecedented numbers. In 1849 alone, an estimated 90,000 people made the journey to California. They came by ship and by wagon, on horseback and on foot. They came from every state in the Union and from countries around the world. They were farmers and city dwellers, educated and illiterate, rich and poor. What united them all was a single, burning desire to find gold and transform their lives. Thomas McKinnon, the Missouri farmer we met earlier, was among those who chose the overland route. He said goodbye to his wife Mary and their children on a cold April morning in 1849, promising to return within 2 years with enough gold to secure their future. Mary stood in the doorway of their small farmhouse, holding their baby daughter, watching as Thomas's wagon disappeared over the hill. She didn't know if she would ever see him again. Chapter 3: The Land of Golden Dreams. When the 49ers finally reached California after their months of hardship and sacrifice, what they found was a land unlike anywhere else on Earth. The territory that had been ceded to the United States by Mexico just 2 years earlier was in the midst of the most dramatic transformation in American history. San Francisco, which had been a sleepy mission town called Yerba Buena, with fewer than 1,000 residents, was exploding into a boomtown of incredible energy and chaos. Ships from around the world crowded the harbor, so many that the masts looked like a forest of leafless trees. Sailors jumped ship the moment they reached port, abandoning their vessels to rush to the gold fields. The harbor became a graveyard of abandoned ships, some of which were eventually dragged ashore and converted into stores, hotels, and saloons. The city itself was a collection of tents, shanties, and hastily constructed wooden buildings. Streets were rivers of mud in winter and clouds of dust in summer. There were no sewers, no organized police force, and few laws. Prices for everything were astronomical. A glass of water might cost $1, equivalent to about $30 today. A simple meal could cost $5, and a hotel room might be $20 a night. Yet despite the primitive conditions, San Francisco pulsed with an electric energy. Gold dust was the common currency, weighed out on small scales in every shop and saloon. Fortunes were made and lost daily, not just in the gold fields, but in the city itself. A man might arrive penniless in the morning and be wealthy by evening, only to lose it all in a card game before midnight. Sam Brannan, the storekeeper who had first announced the gold discovery, became one of the first millionaires of the gold rush, not by mining, but by selling supplies to miners. His store in Sacramento took in more than $150,000 in gold dust in a single month. Levi Strauss, a Bavarian immigrant, began making sturdy work pants for miners, creating what would become the most famous jeans company in the world. But it was in the gold fields themselves where the real drama unfolded. The mining camps that sprang up in the Sierra Nevada foothills had names that reflected both hope and hardship. Hangtown, Rough and Ready, You Bet, Rich Gulch, Poverty Hill, and Last Chance. These camps were raw, masculine places where men lived in tents and crude cabins, working from dawn to dusk in their quest for gold. The early miners, those who arrived in 1848 and early 1849, had found gold relatively easy to obtain. The precious metal lay in the stream beds, mixed with sand and gravel that had been washed down from the mountains over millions of years. This was called placer gold, and it could be extracted using simple techniques that required little more than a pan and patience. The basic method was panning, swirling water, sand, and gravel in a shallow pan, allowing the heavier gold to settle at the bottom while the lighter material washed away. A skilled panner could process about 50 pans of dirt in a day, and if he was lucky, he might find several dollars worth of gold. On a very good day, a miner might make $20 or $30, a fortune when ordinary workers back east earned $1 a day. But as more and more miners arrived, the easy gold began to disappear. Competition became fierce, and miners had to work harder and dig deeper to find paying quantities of gold. They developed more sophisticated techniques, the rocker or cradle, which could process larger amounts of dirt, the long tom, an even more efficient washing device, and eventually hydraulic mining, which used powerful streams of water to wash away entire hillsides. Dr. William Swain, the New York physician whose letters home provide such a vivid account of the gold rush experience, arrived at the mines in August 1849 after his grueling overland journey. His first letters home were full of optimism and excitement. "Dearest Sabrina," he wrote, "I have reached the promised land at last. The country here is beautiful beyond description. Rolling hills covered with oak trees, clear streams running down from snow-capped mountains, and everywhere the sound of picks and shovels as men search for fortune. I have staked a claim on a creek near Hangtown and have already found several small nuggets. The other miners are friendly and helpful, sharing their knowledge freely. I am confident that within a few months, I will have accumulated enough gold to return home and provide comfortably for you and little Cora." But as weeks turned to months, Swain's letters began to reflect the harsh realities of mining life. "The work is backbreaking," he wrote. "I stand in ice-cold water for hours, bent over my pan, my back aching terribly. My hands are raw and bleeding from handling the rough gravel. Some days I find nothing at all, and I begin to wonder if I am wasting my time." The stories of easy wealth were greatly exaggerated. Thomas McKinnon, the Missouri farmer, had similar experiences. After months of hard work at a claim near Nevada City, he had found enough gold to cover his expenses, but little more. In a letter to his wife Mary, he wrote, "The gold is here, but it is not as easy to find as the newspapers claimed. For every man who strikes it rich, there are 100 who barely make enough to eat. I begin to understand why they call this place Poverty Hill." The mining camps were rough, dangerous places where law and order were often maintained by vigilante committees rather than official authorities. Disputes over claims were common, and violence was an ever-present threat. Claim jumping, stealing another man's mining site, was considered one of the worst crimes, sometimes punishable by death. Yet despite the hardships and dangers, there was also a strong sense of community in the camps. Miners from different backgrounds and countries worked side by side, sharing tools, techniques, and stories. On Saturday nights, the camps would come alive with music, dancing, and storytelling. Miners would gather around campfires to read letters from home, play cards, or listen to someone play a fiddle or harmonica. The diversity of the mining camps was remarkable. American-born miners worked alongside immigrants from Mexico, Chile, France, Germany, Ireland, and China. Each group brought their own mining techniques and cultural traditions. The Chinese, in particular, were often skilled at finding gold in claims that others had abandoned, using patient, methodical techniques that American miners had overlooked. However, this diversity also led to tension and discrimination. As the easy gold became harder to find, competition increased and prejudice against foreign miners grew. The California legislature passed discriminatory laws, including the foreign miners tax, which required non-American miners to pay hefty fees for the right to mine. Violence against Chinese, Mexican, and other foreign miners became increasingly common. Despite these problems, the gold fields continued to attract new arrivals daily. Steamships brought fortune seekers from the East Coast, while wagon trains continued to arrive from the overland trails. By 1850, California's population had swollen to over 90,000, and the territory was ready to apply for statehood. The gold rush had transformed not just California, but the entire American West. New towns and cities sprang up almost overnight, connected by a network of roads and trails. Agriculture began to develop to feed the hungry miners, and industries grew to supply their tools and equipment. What had been a sparsely populated frontier was becoming a thriving part of the American economy. But perhaps most importantly, the gold rush was changing the people who participated in it. Men who had lived quiet, predictable lives back east found themselves tested in ways they had never imagined. Some discovered reserves of strength and determination they didn't know they possessed. Others were broken by the harsh conditions and bitter disappointments. Dr. Swain, after a year in the goldfields, had made barely enough to cover his expenses. Homesick and discouraged, he wrote to his wife, "I have learned much about myself in this place. I have learned that I am stronger than I thought, but also that gold is not the only treasure worth seeking. I miss you and Cora more than I can express, and I have decided to return home, whether I strike it rich or not. The real gold is the love of my family." Thomas McKinnon, however, decided to stay another year, convinced that his big strike was just around the corner. His letters home became less frequent, and when they did arrive, they spoke of new claims, new hopes, and new disappointments. Mary waited anxiously at their Missouri farm, struggling to maintain the property and raise their children alone. As the first year of the gold rush drew to a close, it was clear that California would never be the same. The discovery of gold had set in motion forces that would reshape the American continent, bringing prosperity to some, heartbreak to others, and adventure to all who dared to chase the glittering dream in the California hills. Chapter 4: The Boomtowns and Their Stories. As 1850 dawned over the California goldfields, the landscape was dotted with towns that had sprung up like mushrooms after rain. These boomtowns were unlike anything America had ever seen. Raw, energetic places where fortunes could be made or lost in a single day, where men from every corner of the world rubbed shoulders in saloons and supply stores, where the only law was often the law of the gun. Sacramento, situated at the confluence of the American and Sacramento rivers, had grown from Sutter's small settlement into a major supply center for the mines. The town was a maze of muddy streets lined with wooden buildings, canvas tents, and adobe structures left over from the Mexican period. During the winter rains, the streets became rivers of mud so deep that horses and mules sometimes disappeared entirely, leaving only their heads visible above the surface. Despite these primitive conditions, Sacramento bustled with commerce. Steamboats from San Francisco unloaded cargo at the riverfront, mining equipment, food, clothing, and luxuries from around the world. Freight wagons lined up by the dozen, ready to carry supplies to the remote mining camps in the hills. The city's hotels were always full, and meals in the restaurants cost more than most people back east made in a week. Stockton, another river town south of Sacramento, served the southern mines. Here, a young man named Charles Weber had established a trading post that quickly grew into a thriving city. The town's main street was a babel of languages: English, Spanish, French, German, Chinese, and dozens of others, as miners from around the world purchased supplies or sold their gold dust. But it was in the smaller mining camps where the true spirit of the gold rush could be felt most keenly. Nevada City, perched high in the Sierra Nevada foothills, was typical of these settlements. Founded in 1849 by a group of miners from Nevada County, Arkansas, the town clung to steep hillsides surrounded by pine forests and rushing streams. The main street of Nevada City was lined with false-fronted buildings that housed saloons, general stores, hotels, and gambling houses. The National Hotel, a 3-story wooden structure, was considered the finest accommodation in town, though finest was relative. Guests often had to share beds with strangers, and the walls were so thin that conversations from neighboring rooms could be heard clearly. At the heart of every mining town was the general store, which served not only as a place to buy supplies, but as a social center where miners gathered to exchange news, gossip, and stories of strikes and failures. The store in Nevada City was owned by a shrewd businessman named Aaron Rose, who had arrived from Ohio with very little money but possessed a keen understanding of what miners needed. The secret, Rose would tell anyone who asked, is not to mine for gold yourself, but to mine the miners. Sell them what they need, buy their gold dust, and you'll make a steady profit while they're all chasing dreams. Rose's store was crammed with everything a miner might need: pickaxes and shovels, pans and rockers, boots and clothing, food and medicine. He also served as an unofficial banker, weighing out gold dust and exchanging it for credit or cash. His large brass scales sat prominently on the counter, and miners would queue up each evening to settle their accounts. The saloons were equally important to camp life. The Sierra Nevada Hotel and Saloon in Nevada City was a typical establishment, a large room with a bar made from rough planks, tables for card games, and a small stage where traveling entertainers might perform. The proprietor, a former Mississippi riverboat gambler named Jack Hartley, had learned that miners would pay premium prices for anything that reminded them of civilization and home. "These boys are lonely," Hartley would say, polishing glasses behind his bar. "They're thousands of miles from home, working like mules all day in the cold water and mud. Come evening, they want to forget their troubles, have a drink, play some cards, maybe hear a song that reminds them of their sweethearts back home." The entertainment in the saloons was rough but enthusiastic. Traveling musicians would perform popular songs of the day. "Oh, Susanna" was particularly beloved by the miners, who had adopted it as an unofficial anthem of the gold rush. Professional gamblers worked the card tables, and traveling variety shows would sometimes set up in the larger establishments. One particularly memorable evening in Nevada City, a traveling theater troupe performed scenes from Shakespeare's Hamlet. The miners, many of whom had never seen a theatrical performance, were transfixed. When the actor playing Hamlet delivered the famous "to be or not to be" soliloquy, the saloon fell completely silent. At the end of the performance, the miners showed their appreciation by tossing gold nuggets onto the makeshift stage. But life in the mining camps was far from all entertainment and camaraderie. The work was brutal and dangerous, and death was a constant companion. Mining accidents were common: cave-ins, falls from cliffs, explosions from black powder used in blasting. Disease was even more deadly. Cholera, dysentery, and scurvy claimed hundreds of lives. The camps had no doctors, and medical knowledge was limited. A young miner named Patrick O'Brien from County Cork, Ireland, kept a diary that provides a vivid picture of daily life in the camps. "Got up before dawn and walked 2 miles to my claim on Deer Creek," he wrote. "Worked all day in water up to my knees, my back aching something fierce. Found maybe $2 worth of gold dust, barely enough to pay for my food and shelter. 3 men in our camp are sick with the fever, and there's no doctor within 50 miles. We do what we can for them, but I fear the worst." The isolation of the mining camps meant that miners had to be self-reliant in ways that people in settled areas could hardly imagine. They had to serve as their own doctors, dentists, lawyers, and lawmen. When disputes arose, and they frequently did, the miners would hold impromptu trials with juries selected from whoever happened to be available. Justice in the mining camps was swift and sometimes harsh. Theft was considered one of the most serious crimes, since a man's tools and supplies were literally his means of survival. Claim jumping, taking over another man's mining site, was equally serious. Punishments ranged from banishment from the camp to whipping or even hanging for the most serious offenses. Yet despite the hardships and rough justice, there was also a strong code of honor in the camps. A man's word was his bond, and miners would often trust each other with significant amounts of gold dust based on nothing more than a handshake. Hospitality was sacred. No miner would be turned away from a campfire or refused a meal if he was hungry. The Chinese miners, who began arriving in significant numbers in 1850, faced particular challenges. They often worked claims that other miners had abandoned, using patient techniques to extract gold that others had missed. Their different customs, language, and appearance made them targets of suspicion and sometimes violence from other miners. Yet many Chinese miners were remarkably successful. They worked in organized groups, pooling their resources and sharing profits according to carefully worked out agreements. They were often more disciplined than American miners, saving their money rather than spending it on gambling and drink. Some established small businesses in the camps, providing services like laundry and cooking that the American miners were willing to pay for. Ah Toy, a Chinese miner who worked near Grass Valley, kept careful records of his earnings and expenses in a small notebook written in Chinese characters. His meticulous accounts show that while he never struck it rich with a single large find, his steady, methodical approach to mining provided him with a reliable income. After 3 years in California, he had saved enough money to return to China and buy land for his family. The Mexican miners, many of whom had been living in California when it was still part of Mexico, brought sophisticated mining techniques that they had learned in the silver mines of Sonora and other parts of Mexico. They understood geology and could read the landscape in ways that helped them locate promising deposits. However, they faced increasing discrimination as American miners sought to drive them from the gold fields. The foreign miners tax, passed by the California legislature in 1850, required all non-American miners to pay $20 per month for the right to mine, an enormous sum that was designed to force foreign miners to stop mining or leave California entirely. The tax was enforced by collectors who often used violence and intimidation. Many Mexican miners, despite having superior skills and knowledge, were forced to abandon their claims and return to Mexico. French miners, who called themselves Argonauts after the Greek heroes who sought the Golden Fleece, brought their own distinctive culture to the goldfields. They established camps with names like French Camp and French Gulch, where they maintained their language and customs. Many were educated men who had come to California seeking adventure as much as gold. One French miner, Antoine Delacroix, wrote eloquent letters home describing the California landscape and the international community in the mining camps. "It is a remarkable thing," he wrote, "to sit around a campfire in the evening and hear stories told in a dozen different languages by men who have come from every corner of the world to seek their fortune in these golden hills. We are all brothers here, united by hope and hardship." German miners, many of them skilled craftsmen and engineers, often approached mining with scientific methods. They formed mining companies with carefully written constitutions and elected officers. Their camps were typically more organized and cleaner than those of other nationalities, reflecting their methodical approach to life. As the easy placer gold began to play out in 1851 and 1852, many of these boomtowns faced their first major crisis. Miners began to abandon played-out claims and move on to new discoveries. Some towns that had boasted thousands of residents were suddenly nearly empty. Buildings stood vacant and businesses closed their doors, but other towns adapted and survived by diversifying their economies. Nevada City became a center for hydraulic mining, using powerful water cannons to wash away entire hillsides in search of gold. Grass Valley developed into a center for hard rock mining, with deep shafts and complex machinery to extract gold from quartz veins underground. The boomtown phase of the gold rush was coming to an end, but it had left an indelible mark on California and the American West. These rough, energetic communities had proven that Americans could build civilizations anywhere, under any conditions. They had also demonstrated the incredible diversity and entrepreneurial spirit that would continue to define the American character. As 1852 dawned, many of the original 49ers were beginning to make difficult decisions about their futures. Some, like Dr. Swain, had decided to return home to their families. Others, like Thomas McKinnon, were determined to stay and continue searching for the big strike that would make all their sacrifices worthwhile. Still others had found new opportunities in the growing cities and towns of California, abandoning mining for business, farming, or other pursuits. The gold rush was evolving, but it was far from over. Chapter 5: Dreams Fulfilled and Dreams Broken. By 1852, the California gold rush had been transforming lives for 4 years, but the stories emerging from the gold fields were increasingly complex. The early tales of easy wealth had given way to more nuanced accounts of perseverance, adaptation, and sometimes heartbreaking failure. The mining camps were full of men whose experiences ran the full spectrum, from spectacular success to crushing disappointment. James Beckworth, a mixed-race mountain man and explorer, had discovered a pass through the Sierra Nevada mountains that would later bear his name. Unlike many of the 49ers, Beckworth was already familiar with the western frontier. He had spent years as a fur trapper and had lived with various Native American tribes. When the gold rush began, he saw opportunity not just in mining, but in the services that miners needed. Beckworth established a trading post and hotel at his mountain pass, providing food, supplies, and shelter for miners heading to and from the gold fields. His intimate knowledge of the mountains and his relationships with local Indian tribes gave him advantages that most miners lacked. By 1852, he was earning a steady income that far exceeded what most miners made from their claims. The secret, Beckworth would tell visitors to his trading post, is understanding that gold comes in many forms. Sometimes it's the yellow metal you find in streams. Sometimes it's the money you make providing what people need. And sometimes it's the knowledge and experience you gain that proves more valuable than any nugget. Not everyone was so philosophical about their gold rush experience. Samuel Brannan, the storekeeper who had first publicized the gold discovery, had indeed become wealthy, but not primarily from mining. His various business enterprises in San Francisco and Sacramento had made him one of California's first millionaires. Yet Brannan's story also illustrated how quickly fortunes could be lost in Gold Rush, California. Brannan invested heavily in land speculation, assuming that California's rapid growth would continue indefinitely. When the initial gold rush boom began to level off in the early 1850s, many of his investments turned sour. He also became involved in various get-rich-quick schemes and political ventures that drained his resources. By the end of the decade, the man who had once been California's richest citizen was struggling financially. The experiences of ordinary miners were equally varied. William Swain, the New York doctor whose letters home provide such a detailed account of the gold rush experience, had finally made his decision to return home in late 1851. After 2 years in the gold fields, he had accumulated about $500 in gold, enough to cover his expenses, but far less than the fortune he had dreamed of. "My dearest Sabrina," he wrote in his final letter from California, "I have learned that the real gold was not in these streams and hills, but in the love and family I left behind. I have seen men find great wealth only to lose it all to gambling or bad investments. I have seen others work themselves to death chasing dreams that always seem just out of reach. I am wiser now, and perhaps that wisdom is worth more than gold." Swain's homecoming to New York was bittersweet. His wife and daughter welcomed him joyfully, but he struggled to readjust to the routines of small-town life after the excitement and constant change of California. He eventually established a successful medical practice, but he would often tell his patients stories of his gold rush adventures, his eyes taking on a distant look as he remembered the wild freedom of the mining camps. Thomas McKinnon, the Missouri farmer who had left his wife Mary and their children to seek gold, had a very different story. Despite his early struggles, McKinnon had gradually learned the skills of successful mining. He had formed a partnership with 2 other experienced miners, and together they had developed several profitable claims near Grass Valley. By 1852, McKinnon was sending regular remittances home to Mary, sometimes as much as $200 or $300 at a time, far more than their farm had ever earned. His letters home were filled with optimism and plans for the future. "My darling Mary," he wrote, "I believe we have finally found our fortune. The claim we're working has produced consistently for 6 months now, and there are signs that we may have found the mother lode. I estimate that within another year, we will have enough to buy the finest farm in Missouri and still have money left over for the children's education." But Mary's letters back to Thomas revealed a different kind of struggle. Raising 2 children alone while managing the farm had taken its toll. Their son had fallen seriously ill during the winter, and without Thomas's income from mining, Mary had been forced to sell some of their livestock to pay for medicine. "I am proud of your success, my dear husband," she wrote, "but I confess that I grow weary of this separation. The children ask for their father daily, and I fear they are forgetting what you look like. Please consider whether the gold you're finding is worth the family you're missing. The Chinese miners faced their own unique challenges and opportunities during this period. The foreign miners' tax had been reduced from its original $20 per month to a more manageable $3, but discrimination and violence against Chinese miners remained common. Despite these obstacles, many Chinese miners were remarkably successful, often through methods that other miners overlooked. Ah Sing, who had arrived from Guangdong province in 1851, worked with a company of 12 other Chinese miners. While American miners often moved from claim to claim seeking quick strikes, Ah Sing's group would take over abandoned claims and work them systematically, using traditional Chinese mining techniques that could extract gold from dirt that others had considered worthless. The Americans are impatient, Ah Sing wrote in a letter to his family in China. They want to find large nuggets quickly, and when they don't, they abandon good ground. We have patience. We know that many small grains of gold equal one large nugget, and we are willing to work for them. Ah Sing's company had developed an efficient system. Some members worked the claims while others provided services to the camp: cooking, laundry, and vegetable gardening. They pooled their earnings and sent regular remittances back to China while maintaining a simple lifestyle in California. By 1852, several members of the company had earned enough to return to China as wealthy men by Chinese standards. The success of Chinese miners created resentment among some American miners who were struggling as the easy gold became harder to find. Violence against Chinese miners increased, and several Chinese camps were attacked and burned. The lack of official law enforcement in many areas meant that such attacks often went unpunished. Mexican miners faced similar challenges. Many had been working California's gold regions since before the American conquest, and their knowledge of local geology and mining techniques was often superior to that of the newly arrived Americans. Carlos Vega, a miner from Sonora, had been working the same area near Mariposa since 1848, gradually developing it into one of the most productive claims in the region. My grandfather mined silver in Zacatecas, Vega would tell anyone who would listen. My father taught me to read the rocks and the water, to understand where the gold wants to hide. These American miners, they dig holes everywhere like gophers, but they don't understand the mountain's secrets. Despite his expertise and success, Vega faced constant pressure from American miners who wanted to drive him from their gold fields. The foreign miners' tax collectors harassed him regularly, and there had been several attempts to jump his claim. By 1852, despite the profitability of his mining operation, Vega was considering returning to Mexico. "The gold is here," he wrote to his brother in Hermosillo, "but the hatred is stronger than the gold. Each day it becomes more dangerous for Mexicanos to work in these hills. Perhaps it is time to take what we have earned and return to our own country." French miners had formed several successful companies, bringing European organizational methods to California mining. The French company of Mokelumne Hill had established one of the most efficient mining operations in the Mother Lode, using hydraulic techniques learned from engineers who had worked in European mines. Pierre Dubois, a former engineering student from Lyon, had helped design a complex system of flumes and sluices that could process enormous amounts of gold-bearing gravel. "We approach this scientifically," he explained to visitors to their operation. "We study the geology, we calculate the volume of material we must process, we design our equipment for maximum efficiency. This is not gambling. This is engineering." The French company's systematic approach paid off handsomely. By 1852, they were among the most successful mining operations in California, and several members had accumulated substantial fortunes. However, their success also attracted unwanted attention from less successful miners who accused them of using unfair advantages. American miners were also adapting and learning. John Studebaker, a young wheelwright from Indiana, had come to California not to mine, but to make wheelbarrows for miners. His sturdy, well-designed wheelbarrows were in constant demand, and he often received payment in gold dust rather than cash. "I figured out early that the real money wasn't in digging gold, but in selling tools to the diggers," Studebaker later recalled. Every miner needed a good wheelbarrow, and they were willing to pay premium prices for quality equipment. Studebaker's success in California provided the capital he would later use to start the Studebaker Wagon Company, which would become one of America's major vehicle manufacturers. His story illustrated how the gold rush created opportunities far beyond mining itself. Women, though far outnumbered by men in Gold Rush California, also found unique opportunities. Mary Jane McQueer, a doctor's wife from Maine, had accompanied her husband to California and quickly discovered that her domestic skills were in enormous demand. "I can earn more money in one day washing and cooking for miners than my husband makes in a week with his medical practice," she wrote to her sister back east. "These men are desperate for home cooking and clean laundry. They will pay almost any price for a good meal or clean clothes." Mrs. McQueer established a boarding house in San Francisco that catered to successful miners and businessmen. Her reputation for excellent food and clean accommodations allowed her to charge premium prices. Within 2 years, she had accumulated more wealth than most miners ever saw. Dame Shirley, the pen name of Louise Amelia Knapp Smith Clapp, provided some of the most vivid and detailed accounts of life in the mining camps. Her letters, published in a California magazine, painted a picture of camp life that was both romantic and realistic. "The miners," she wrote, "are like children playing an elaborate game. They rise before dawn, full of hope and excitement about what they might find that day. They work with tremendous energy and determination, always convinced that the next pan of dirt will contain their fortune. When evening comes, they gather around their campfires to tell stories and sing songs, their faces glowing with the eternal optimism that keeps them going." But Dame Shirley also recorded the darker side of mining camp life, the violence, the loneliness, the gradual disillusionment of men who had sacrificed everything for dreams that remained forever out of reach. As 1852 progressed, it became clear that the gold rush was entering a new phase. The days of easy surface gold were largely over. Mining was becoming more complex, requiring more capital, more sophisticated equipment, and more technical knowledge. Individual miners were increasingly being replaced by mining companies with the resources to work deeper claims and more difficult terrain. Some miners adapted to these changes. They formed partnerships, pooled their resources, and invested in better equipment. Others were forced to abandon mining altogether, seeking work in California's growing cities or returning to their homes back east. The evolution of the gold rush was creating winners and losers, but it was also creating something unprecedented in American history, a society that was truly diverse, truly democratic, and truly dynamic. In the mining camps and boomtowns of California, men from every background and every nation worked together, competed together, and sometimes fought together, but always with the shared understanding that in America, any man might strike it rich if he had the courage to try. Chapter 6. The Changing Face of California. As the California Gold Rush entered its 5th year in 1853, the character of both the mining regions and the state as a whole was undergoing dramatic transformation. The wild, freewheeling atmosphere of the early days was giving way to something more organized, more civilized, but perhaps less exciting than the pioneers had known. San Francisco had evolved from a collection of tents and shanties into a real city, though one unlike any other in America. The population had swelled to over 50,000, making it the largest city west of St. Louis. Brick and stone buildings were replacing the wooden structures that had been hastily erected during the first years of the rush. The city now boasted legitimate theaters, fine restaurants, and even an opera house where European performers entertained audiences willing to pay extraordinary prices for culture. Yet San Francisco retained its boomtown character. Gambling was still the city's favorite pastime, with elaborate casinos operating openly on every major street. The most famous of these was the El Dorado, a palatial establishment with crystal chandeliers, fine carpets, and gaming tables that never closed. On any given night, fortunes in gold dust and nuggets would change hands across the green felt tables. The city's newspapers, including the Daily Alta California and the Sacramento Union, had become important voices not just in California, but throughout the nation. Their correspondents sent dispatches about California life to newspapers back east, shaping America's understanding of the gold rush experience. One particularly influential journalist was Bayard Taylor, who had come to California as a correspondent for the New York Tribune. His dispatches painted vivid pictures of California life that captivated readers across the nation. San Francisco, Taylor wrote, is a city without childhood or youth. It sprang into existence full grown, with all the energy and ambition of maturity, but also with all the rough edges that age usually smooths away. It is a place where a man can reinvent himself completely, where the past matters less than the present, and where the future is always bright with possibility. Sacramento had also grown dramatically, establishing itself as the political and commercial center of Northern California. When California achieved statehood in 1850, Sacramento had been chosen as the capital, though the legislature would move the seat of government several times before finally settling there permanently. The city's location at the confluence of the American and Sacramento rivers made it the natural gateway to the goldfields. Paddle wheel steamers regularly churned up the rivers from San Francisco, their decks loaded with supplies and their passenger cabins filled with new arrivals seeking their fortunes. But it was in the mining regions themselves where the most significant changes were occurring. The easy placer gold that had attracted the 49ers was largely exhausted by 1853. Mining was becoming a more complex, capital-intensive enterprise that required different skills and different approaches. Hydraulic mining was transforming entire landscapes. Using powerful streams of water directed through large nozzles called monitors, miners could wash away entire hillsides in their search for gold. The technique was enormously effective, but also environmentally devastating. Millions of tons of debris were washed into the rivers, causing floods downstream and destroying agricultural land. Near Nevada City, the Malakoff mine had become one of the largest hydraulic operations in California. The pit created by their operations was hundreds of feet deep and could be seen for miles. James Haggerty, an Irish immigrant who had started as a simple placer miner, had become the mine's superintendent. "It's a different kind of mining now," Haggerty explained to visitors. "We're not looking for nuggets in creek beds anymore. We're processing thousands of tons of gravel every day, extracting tiny particles of gold that the early miners never would have bothered with. It takes machinery, organization, and capital that individual miners just don't have." The Malakoff mine employed dozens of workers, not just miners, but engineers, mechanics, and laborers who maintained the complex system of flumes, reservoirs, and hydraulic equipment. It was industrial mining on a scale that would have been impossible during the early days of the gold rush. Hard rock mining was also developing rapidly. As miners learned more about the geology of the Sierra Nevada, they discovered that much of the region's gold was contained in quartz veins that ran deep underground. Extracting this gold required shaft mining, digging deep tunnels and hauling ore to the surface for processing. The Empire Mine near Grass Valley had become one of the most successful hard rock operations in California. William Bourne Sr., a shrewd businessman from Massachusetts, had invested heavily in the mine, bringing in experienced miners from Cornwall, England, who had decades of experience in underground mining. The Cousin Jacks, as the Cornish miners were called, brought sophisticated techniques for following quartz veins deep into the earth. They knew how to shore up tunnels, how to blast through solid rock, and how to operate the complex machinery needed to crush quartz and extract gold from the ore. The Empire Mine's operations required substantial investment in equipment, steam engines to power the hoisting machinery, stamp mills to crush the ore, and mercury to separate the gold from other minerals. But the investment paid off handsomely. By 1853, the mine was producing tens of thousands of dollars worth of gold annually and would continue operating for decades to come. These industrial mining operations provided steady employment for hundreds of workers, but they also marked the end of the era when an individual miner with simple tools could hope to strike it rich. The romance of the gold rush was giving way to the business of mining. Many of the original 49ers found themselves at a crossroads. Some, like our friend Thomas McKinnon, had managed to adapt to the changing conditions. McKinnon had sold his interest in his original claim and invested the proceeds in a hydraulic mining company near Oroville. His engineering background from his farming days had served him well in understanding the technical aspects of the new mining methods. "The gold is still here," McKinnon wrote to his wife Mary, "but finding it requires different skills now. It's less about luck and more about knowledge and organization. I believe I can make more money as part of a well-run company than I ever could working alone." McKinnon's success had finally enabled him to send for his family. In the spring of 1853, Mary and their children made the long journey to California, traveling by ship via Panama. Their reunion in Sacramento was emotional. They had been separated for 4 years, and the children barely remembered their father. "California is not what I expected," Mary wrote to her sister back in Missouri. "It's more civilized than the story suggested, but also more expensive and more dangerous. Thomas has done well, but I sometimes wonder if the price we paid in separation and worry was worth the gold we've gained." Other miners were less successful in adapting to the changing conditions. Dr. William Swain, who had returned to New York, represented thousands of miners who had given up their California dreams and returned home. Some left California wealthy, others broke, but all had been changed by their experience. John Hammonds, a farmer from Illinois who had spent 3 years in the goldfields, returned home in 1853 with less money than he had when he started. But his letters home revealed that he didn't consider his gold rush experience a failure. "I didn't find the fortune I was looking for," he wrote to his brother, "but I found something else. I found out what I was capable of. I survived hardships that would have broken the man who left Illinois 3 years ago. I worked alongside men from every nation on earth and learned that courage and determination are the same in any language. I came back poorer in gold, but richer in experience." The Chinese miners were also adapting to the changing conditions, though they faced unique challenges. As individual mining became less profitable, many Chinese miners transitioned to other occupations. Some became merchants, opening stores that served both Chinese and American customers. Others became farmers, growing vegetables that they sold to mining camps and growing cities. Ah Sing, the Chinese miner we met earlier, had used his mining profits to establish a general store in Sacramento's growing Chinatown. His store served as a cultural center for the Chinese community, providing not just goods but also services like letter writing for illiterate miners and money transfer to China. "The gold in the ground is limited," Ah Sing wrote to his family in China, "but the gold in commerce is unlimited. Every day, more people come to California, and they all need food, clothing, and services. This is where the real opportunity lies." The Chinese community in California was becoming increasingly organized and self-sufficient. They established their own temples, schools, and social organizations. They also developed sophisticated systems for sending money back to China and for bringing new immigrants to California. However, anti-Chinese sentiment was also growing. As economic conditions became more competitive, some American miners and workers began to view the Chinese as unfair competition. Discriminatory laws were passed, and violence against Chinese immigrants increased. The Mexican and South American miners faced similar challenges. Many had been driven from the gold fields by discriminatory laws and violence, but others had found new opportunities in California's changing economy. Some became cattle ranchers, supplying beef to the mining camps and growing cities. Others established businesses in the urban areas. Carlos Vega, the experienced Mexican miner from Sonora, had indeed decided to leave the gold fields, but instead of returning to Mexico, he had used his mining profits to buy land near Los Angeles. He established a cattle ranch that supplied beef to Southern California's growing population. "The Americans wanted the gold," Vega wrote to his brother, "so I let them have it. But they also need beef to eat, and I know how to raise cattle. Sometimes the smartest move is to step aside and find a different path to prosperity." Women were also finding new opportunities in Gold Rush, California. The severe shortage of women in the early years had created unique economic opportunities for those who were willing to make the journey west. Mrs. Mary Jane McQueer, the boarding house owner from Maine we met earlier, had expanded her operations significantly. By 1853, She owned 3 boarding houses in San Francisco and employed a staff of Chinese cooks and housekeepers. Her success had made her one of the wealthiest women in California. "I came to California as the wife of a doctor," she wrote to her sister, "but I've become a businesswoman in my own right. The opportunities here for a woman with energy and determination are unlike anything available back east." Other women found success in less conventional ways. Lola Montez, a famous dancer and actress, toured the mining camps, performing in theaters and opera houses that had been built in the larger towns. Her performances were wildly popular with miners who were starved for entertainment and culture. Some women became successful entrepreneurs. Mary Ellen Pleasant, an African-American woman who had come to California during the early years of the gold rush, established several successful businesses in San Francisco, including restaurants and boarding houses that catered to the city's growing African-American community. As 1853 drew to a close, it was clear that the California gold rush had evolved far beyond its original form. The wild, chaotic excitement of the early years had given way to a more organized but still dynamic society. California had achieved statehood, developed thriving cities, and established industries that went far beyond mining. The state's population had stabilized at around 300,000, still predominantly male, but increasingly diverse in terms of occupation and background. Agriculture was beginning to develop as miners turned to farming, and as the state's cities created markets for food production. Manufacturing was also emerging to serve local needs. Yet the dream of gold still drew newcomers to California. The steamships still arrived regularly in San Francisco, and wagon trains still crossed the Sierra Nevada, though in smaller numbers than during the peak years. The mining camps still buzzed with activity, though the activity was increasingly industrial rather than individual. California had been transformed from a remote frontier territory into an integral part of the American nation. The gold rush had accelerated the development of the entire American West and had demonstrated that Americans could build thriving communities anywhere, under any conditions. But perhaps most importantly, the gold rush had proven that America was truly a land of opportunity, not just for native-born Americans, but for immigrants from around the world. In the mining camps and boomtowns of California, traditional social distinctions had been temporarily suspended, and success depended more on determination and adaptability than on family background or social position. As the participants in the Great California Adventure settled into their new lives, whether in California, back in their home states, or in countries around the world, they carried with them the knowledge that they had been part of something unprecedented in human history. They had witnessed the transformation of a wilderness into a civilization in the space of just a few years, and they had played their part in creating the modern American West. The gold rush was evolving, but the dreams and the opportunities it represented would continue to shape California and America for generations to come. Chapter 7, Legacy of Gold. As our long tale draws toward its close, let us reflect on what the Great California Gold Rush meant, not just for those who lived through it, but for the generations that followed. By 1855, the California Gold Rush as a mass movement was largely over. The easy gold had been found. The boomtowns had either grown into permanent cities or withered into ghost towns, and the mining industry had become the domain of large companies with industrial equipment rather than individual prospectors with simple tools. Yet the impact of those 7 extraordinary years would reverberate through American history for decades to come. The gold rush had transformed not only California, but the entire character of the American nation. It had demonstrated the power of American optimism and determination, and it had established patterns of migration, development, and social change that would define the settlement of the American West. Thomas McKinnon, our Missouri farmer who had left his family to seek gold in California, had finally achieved the success that had eluded him for so many years. His investment in hydraulic mining had paid off handsomely, and by 1855, he had accumulated enough wealth to purchase a large ranch in the Sacramento Valley. His wife Mary and their children had joined him in California, and they had built a comfortable life in their adopted state. I sometimes think about the farm we left in Missouri, Thomas wrote in his final letter to his brother back east, and I wonder if we could have been just as happy there. But then I look at my children who are growing up as Californians, and I see opportunities for them here that never would have existed back home. My son talks of becoming an engineer, and my daughter attends one of the finest schools in Sacramento. The gold I found in these hills was just the beginning. The real treasure has been the life we've built here. Mary McKinnon had adapted to California life more successfully than she had initially expected. The rough frontier conditions of the early gold rush years had given way to a more settled society, and California's cities offered cultural and educational opportunities that rivaled those of the East Coast. California has grown up around us, she wrote to her sister. What was once a wilderness filled with wild-eyed prospectors has become a proper state with fine homes, good schools, and thriving businesses. My children consider themselves Californians first and Americans second, and perhaps that's as it should be. This is their home, and they will help build its future. Dr. William Swain, who had returned to New York after 2 difficult years in the goldfields, had used his California experience to build a successful medical practice. His stories of life in the mining camps fascinated his patients and neighbors, and he became something of a local celebrity. But Swain's most important contribution to gold rush history was the hundreds of letters he had written to his wife during his California adventure. These letters, carefully preserved by his family, would eventually become one of the most valuable historical records of the gold rush experience, providing future generations with an intimate, detailed account of what it was really like to be a 49er. I have no regrets about my California adventure, Swain wrote in his diary years later. I didn't find the fortune I was seeking, but I found something perhaps more valuable. I learned what I was capable of enduring and achieving. Every man should test himself against the unknown at least once in his life. The Chinese miners who had come to California during the gold rush had established a permanent community that would play an important role in the state's development. Many had used their mining profits to establish businesses, and by 1855, California's Chinatowns were thriving commercial and cultural centers. Ah Sing, whose patient mining methods had proved so successful, had expanded his Sacramento store into one of the largest import businesses on the West Coast. He specialized in bringing goods from China, tea, silk, porcelain, and specialty foods, to serve not only the Chinese community but also American customers who had developed a taste for Asian products. The gold rush brought us to America, like Ah Sing wrote to his family in China, but it was our own hard work and business skills that allowed us to stay and prosper. We are no longer temporary visitors seeking quick wealth. We are permanent residents building a future for our children. The Chinese community's success came despite continuing discrimination and violence. Anti-Chinese sentiment had actually increased as economic competition intensified. However, the community's economic importance to California's development provided some protection, and Chinese businesses became an integral part of the state's economy. Mexican and South American miners had faced even more severe discrimination, and many had been forced to leave the goldfields entirely. However, some had found success in other aspects of California's economy. Carlos Vega, the Sonoran miner who had become a cattle rancher, had built one of the largest ranching operations in Southern California. The Americans took the gold, Vega wrote to his brother in Mexico, but they left us the land, and land is more valuable than gold in the long run. My cattle feed the miners and the city dwellers, and every year my herds grow larger. My children will inherit something more permanent than a played-out mine. The rancheros who had owned vast land grants under Mexican rule had faced mixed fortunes during the gold rush era. Some had lost their lands to American settlers and legal challenges, but others had prospered by selling beef and other supplies to the mining camps. The Native American tribes of California had suffered terribly during the gold rush. The massive influx of miners and settlers had destroyed traditional hunting and gathering grounds, and many tribes had been driven from their ancestral lands. Disease, violence, and starvation had reduced California's native population from an estimated 150,000 before the gold rush to fewer than 30,000 by 1860. Some individual Native Americans had found ways to adapt to the changing conditions. Captain John, a Miwok leader who had worked with John Sutter before the gold rush, had established a small ranch near Stockton where he raised cattle and grew crops to sell to nearby mining camps. "The old ways are gone," Captain John told a newspaper reporter in 1855. "My people must learn new ways if we are to survive. I teach my children to read and write English, and I show them how to succeed in the American world because that is the world they must live in now." The environmental impact of the gold rush was enormous and permanent. Hydraulic mining had washed millions of tons of debris into California's rivers, causing massive flooding in the Central Valley and destroying thousands of acres of agricultural land. The debris had also filled San Francisco Bay with sediment, changing its shape and depth permanently. Hard rock mining had left thousands of miles of tunnels beneath the Sierra Nevada, and the mercury used in gold processing had contaminated streams and groundwater throughout the mining regions. The environmental damage from the gold rush would persist for decades and in some cases continues to affect California today. Yet the gold rush had also spurred the development of California's cities and infrastructure. San Francisco had grown from a village to a major port city. Sacramento had become a thriving capital. Dozens of smaller cities throughout the mining regions had been established, connected by roads, telegraph lines, and eventually railroads. The economic impact extended far beyond California. The gold discovered during the California Gold Rush provided much of the capital for America's rapid industrial expansion in the second half of the 19th century. Eastern banks and businesses had invested heavily in California mining operations, and the profits had flowed back to fund railroads, factories, and other development projects. The California Gold Rush had also established patterns of Western migration that would continue for decades. The trails blazed by the 49ers became permanent routes of commerce and settlement. The techniques developed for organizing wagon trains and establishing frontier communities would be used by later pioneers settling throughout the American West. Perhaps most importantly, the gold rush had demonstrated that America was truly a land of opportunity where social mobility was possible. Men from humble backgrounds had become wealthy, while others from privileged families had lost everything. Success depended more on determination, adaptability, and luck than on family connections or inherited wealth. This democratic spirit of the gold rush would become part of the American mythology. The idea that any person, regardless of background, could strike it rich through hard work and perseverance became a central theme in American culture. The term striking it rich entered the American vocabulary, and the image of the rugged individual seeking his fortune in the wilderness became an enduring symbol of American values. The gold rush had also accelerated California's admission to the Union as a free state, helping to tip the balance of power in the growing national debate over slavery. California's rapid population growth and economic importance gave it significant political influence, and its senators and representatives would play important roles in the events leading up to the Civil War. Women who had participated in the gold rush, either directly or by managing families and businesses while their husbands were away, had gained new independence and economic opportunities. Many had discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed, and some had achieved financial success that would have been impossible in more traditional Eastern communities. The technological innovations developed during the gold rush, hydraulic mining, improved transportation systems, new methods of ore processing, would be applied to mining operations throughout the American West. The organizational methods developed by mining companies would influence the development of other industries as well. Educational institutions established during the gold rush era, including what would become the University of California, would help develop the scientific and technical knowledge needed for the state's continued growth. The cultural institutions, theaters, newspapers, libraries, established during the boom years would provide the foundation for California's continued development as a center of American culture. As the 1850s progressed and the gold rush era officially ended, California had been permanently transformed. the state's population had stabilized at around 400,000, making it one of the most populous states in the Union. Its economy had diversified beyond mining to include agriculture, manufacturing, and commerce. Its cities had developed into major centers of American business and culture. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the California Gold Rush was psychological and cultural. It had proven that dramatic change was possible, that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things, and that America was indeed a land where dreams could come true for those willing to work for them. The miners who returned to their home states carried with them not just gold dust, but stories of adventure, tales of success and failure, and most importantly, the knowledge that the American West offered opportunities that existed nowhere else in the world. These stories would inspire future generations of Americans to seek their own fortunes on the frontier. The immigrants who had come to California from around the world had established communities that would continue to grow and prosper. They had proven that America could successfully integrate people from many different cultures and backgrounds, creating a society that was stronger and more dynamic than any homogeneous community could be. As our long story comes to its end, we can see that the California Gold Rush was about much more than the discovery and extraction of gold. It was about the discovery and development of human potential, about the creation of new communities and new opportunities, and about the ongoing American experiment in democracy and freedom. The 49ers who had rushed to California seeking quick wealth had found something more valuable and more lasting. They had found new ways of living and working together, new methods of organizing society, and new possibilities for human achievement. They had helped create modern California and had contributed to the development of the entire American West. In the quiet mining camps, where only a few old-timers remained, in the bustling cities that had grown from tent settlements, in the homes of families who had been created or reunited during the gold rush years, the legacy of those extraordinary times lived on. The gold that had brought them all together was finite. Much of it had been extracted by 1860, and the rest would be claimed by industrial mining operations. But the society they had created, the institutions they had established, and the dreams they had proved possible would endure for generations to come. And so ends our tale of the great California Gold Rush, a story of courage and greed, of success and failure, of dreams fulfilled and dreams deferred. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of those wild days when the West was young and anything seemed possible to those brave enough to chase their dreams across a continent. Sleep well, and remember that in America, the spirit of the gold rush, the belief that tomorrow might bring new opportunities for those willing to work for them, lives on still. Sweet dreams.